Hi.
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 Hi, is everything working okay?
Sorry? You can't hear it.
Can you all see me? Is everything working okay?
Yeah, we can see you.
Ah, spectacular. Thank you for bearing with me. I think my browser was being a bit petulant.
Hey, Yepoka, I'm Krishna.
Hi, nice to finally see you.
Finally, we've been exchanging mails for quite some time now.
We have.
So,
Oh,
I'll just brief you through while I'm here. So, what you're looking at now is the Bangalore team,
Hi.
nice to meet you, Bangalore team.
and we have Pamika from I forgot, sorry, Ahmedabad. Sorry, Pamika from Ahmedabad,
Hi.
Hi,
and we have
nice to see
Sneha
you.
from Hyderabad.
Hello.
Hi, Sneha.
We have Ashneya from Delhi, but she's not in Delhi.
Delhi, but not in Delhi. Got it.
Yes. Hi.
And
Hi.
Aditya, he's also from Delhi.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you.
So, Yepoka, so you can just tell them who you are, what we're going to talk about. Just give them a quick brief of why we are all here today.
Hi, sorry, would you mind repeating that? I didn't quite
Yeah,
hear
yeah.
it.
So you can just give them an introduction about you, even though I've sent them a mail briefing, I've sent them your stories, they've all read your story. And
Oh, wow, really?
yeah,
All 7,000 words of it.
they
Thank you for
love you.
slogging through it.
They're very excited to talk to you about that.
Wonderful. Um, so it's basically, oh, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Yepoka Yeebo. Right now I work as a freelance journalist, and in the past year I've written mostly about Ghana and China as well, mostly sort of Africans working and trading in China. And the story was about the biggest slum in Ghana, which is this great big, sprawling, fascinating place called Sodom and Gomorrah. And so I spent the best part of about a year reporting it and talking to people before it actually turned into a piece.
Okay, so Yepoka, how did you come about this particular subject to write a story about?
Hi, sorry, there's a ton of interference on the line. Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah. So, how did you come about choosing this particular for your story?
Well, I was looking for a big story I could write in Ghana because I wanted something really, really meaty to focus my reporting. I'd basically only just started as a freelancer, without a beat. I was sort of lost, so I was doing a whole bunch of disconnected bits of work, and it was really hard to sort of keep myself motivated and keep myself going and sort of keep a sense of my larger purpose. So I went to the editor of the Big Round Table, Michael Shapiro, who was also one of my professors at journalism school, and he told me what I needed was a beat. I needed a place to go, a place where when I was feeling nervous or unsure about my reporting, I could just go and hang out and watch things unfold. And I told him about the slum I'd stumbled into, and he said it sounded like a story. It was basically, gosh, it's such a long story now I think about it. I was working on another story about a giant electronic waste dump in Accra called Agbogboshi, and I met this kid who was from my dad's village, which absolutely never happens because it's a tiny, tiny village with 2 roads. And I was stunned by the fact that our lives had turned out so differently, even though we came from essentially the same place. So I got obsessed with it. And he lived in the slum, and I wanted to go and visit, but nobody would come with me. Everybody said it was too dangerous for a girl, it was too dangerous for a foreigner. And I went through like every friend I had in Ghana, every member of my family, an uncle who used to be the member of parliament of the area. And in the end, on one of my last days during a trip to Ghana, my granddad offered to go with me. And he's like 80 and rickety, and it was really, really amusing to get him up at 4 a.m. and drag him all the way to this place. And it ended up being a fascinating trip, and that's how I met my fixer, that's how I met some of my characters, and that's how I decided to start going there.
Wow, this is really quite an experience.
It really was, yeah.
So these guys have certain questions from the story that they've read.
Yes, yeah, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So who wants to go first? So Vidya Das, Vidya, right?
So it seems like you got really long number of interviews for making this story happen. Making this story happen. So how did you make it happen that you got so many interviews? Like you didn't have any idea about connect the dots before you made the story. So you
Sorry,
have,
would you mind repeating the question again?
yeah.
I couldn't hear it over the line.
So I was asking that you would have had lots of interviews done while writing the story. So you would have met a lot of people.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So you would have had no idea when you're meeting these people that this interviews will turn out to be this particular thing. So
Hey,
connect.
sorry, I'm losing you again. I'm so sorry, it's a terrible line.
Yeah. So can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, that's great.
So while making the story, you would have gone through a lot of interviews, right? So
Yes, yeah.
and while talking to these people, you would have had no idea how the story would have turned out to be.
Yeah, no, I would have had no
Yeah,
bloody
exactly. So
idea.
while
Yeah.
going through this, like while meeting a lot of people, while we write long stories and long forms, so we have
Yeah.
to go through a lot of interviews and research and stuff. So
Yeah.
how did you do it, right? So how did you have this idea that I can make this happen in a certain way, or who are the right people to talk to?
Oh, okay. That's a great question. I initially had no idea how the story would turn out, as you said. So my first approach was just to talk to absolutely everyone, which was a disaster because you end up getting way more than you need, and you also end up having no idea where to go. So I talked to my editor, who suggested just picking one place and starting all my reporting from that point. So that's how we ended up setting on the bridge, because it's the way in and out of the slum. Everybody uses it, and it was a great place to sort of hang out and talk to people, and it was also a great place to follow people around from. And that's how most of my reporting ended up being organized. I'd go there first thing, I talked to the owners, I'd talk to the people crossing the bridge, and then if I met someone who was chatty and responsive, I'd follow them around the slum. So I'd follow them home, I'd follow them to work, I'd follow them to the market. And that ended up being the way I got most of my main characters. And then they'd bring up issues like the infrastructure project that's a big part of the story, or like the fact that they have to steal water from the hospital, and then I'd go and sort of track that story down. So somebody mentioned the water lines, we followed them back to the hospital, or somebody wanted to know what was happening with the infrastructure project, so I went and spoke to the city councillor who was organizing this. I talked to sort of all the people around that.
So while interviewing these people, it's like particularly like some people are resistant to what you're asking, or they might not be so open to answering questions, right? So how do you get through those awkward moments of not being able to get what you're looking for?
It was difficult. I had to sort of go gently with a lot of the sources. Like, I talked to a man called Robert Anser who was running the dredging project, which ended up being a massive scandal. And I had to talk to him maybe 2 or 3 times before I got all the answers to my different questions. And I'd have to sort of approach the question from different directions. So I'd ask it directly, and then I'd go away and talk to other sources about the issue, and any objections they come up with, I'd take back to them. So,
One second. I'm just going to add one second.
sure.
Hello?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can go.
Hello?
So it's just that there was one more team, another city who just came online. So I was just adding them in the Hangout.
Great, okay.
They were here, so they are from Pune. I'll talk to them. We'll just quickly meet them and we'll get back to them. Vidoj? Okay, so we'll just wait for them to come online. Any other question? Any other question?
When do you
Oh no, I couldn't do that. Hello?
Yeah, one second. So this is the team from Pune. Hi, Amitosh, can you hear?
See you all.
Yeah. So Amitosh, can you hear us? Uh, can you tell us who all there?
Okay, this is Manjusha and Amitoj.
Okay. So everyone say hi to our guest today.
I can't hear you.
Yeah. So you are here. Jay joined us from Maharashtra actually. So we'll get back to our conversation now.
Okay.
Great. Which question would you like me? What would you like me to go back to? I have family there, so I mostly sort of stayed with family. I did try to do a couple of really, really early mornings and really, really late nights, but I didn't necessarily feel super safe spending the night there. It was still a risky place, and it was still a little unstable. Yeah.
So Yepoka, do you have any sort of guidance or advice for any of the writers here if they want to do a story similar to yours? What kind of advice would you give?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
Um, I'd say to make it easier on yourself, pick sort of a place you're familiar with but curious about, and a topic you sort of know the general gist of. Something you can spend time on while you're still working or studying. Something you can develop over a period of time, and something that's really, really easy to do. I ended up doing this while based in London, so I did it over the course of like 4 or 5 trips to Prague, and that ended up being incredibly difficult just because I was sort of in and out. All the developments, all the really juicy stuff would happen when I wasn't on the ground, and so I couldn't follow it as closely as I'd like to.
So Ipuga, you okay? So he just lost me. Okay, this is Amitoj, hi.
Can you
Can
hear
you
us,
hear us?
guys?
Yeah. Can you hear us? Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, so I think Yabuka must have lost a connection. We're just waiting 2 minutes for her to come back.
Krishna, there's a lot of interference because we can't hear you. The video and the audio keeps switching from
Oh
both.
yeah, so so the thing is there might be a slight lag with Google Hangout because there are multiple people in the conversation. So
Right.
if you guys are not talking, you can just turn off your mic so that it reduces the disturbance.
All right, cool. When we
So
off
if
the
any of
mic.
you want to talk, you can just show up 5 fingers and
All right,
Hi.
let us know when to come on then.
yeah,
I'm
I tell
so sorry about that. I got cut off.
We
yeah.
do that. We tell you WhatsApp us when we can have our question and answer session.
Okay. Who wants to take the next question?
Oh, can I add one more thing actually before we change the
Sure.
subject?
Sure. Yeah.
The most valuable thing I did was that I wrote up my reporting as soon as I got home. So it was all fresh in my mind, and I'd remember things that I didn't necessarily get notes on. And then I wrote it up in one room in my own voice. So instead of a series of disjointed notes, I had these sort of giant memos that tracked everything I saw, everything I heard, everything I smelled, and every detail of every interview. And then I ended up filing a lot of these with my editors, and they didn't give me feedback on those, but they sort of they read them and they got a sense of the issue, so that when it came to crafting the story, it was basically already there. And this was like the most valuable thing ever. It was already half written, and you all know that writing is mostly rewriting and getting it tighter and better. And it really helped to already have this very, very rough but like really comprehensive draft to work from.
Who wants to go with the next question? Sneha?
Yeah.
Hi.
I had a question for you. How did you stay motivated while you were writing this? I mean, the way you describe the film is really hard because it's very easy to, like, I don't want to say it anymore. Let me just go another get another story. Like, how did you stick to it and, persistently kept working on the story?
Sorry, there was a little bit of an echo, so I didn't hear the full thing.
Okay.
But
How did you stick to the storyline and persistently you kept working on it and you kept developing it? What was your main motivation for this work?
I think in the beginning it was incredibly shaky. Like, there's always a point in the story where you question why the hell you're doing it in the first place. Like, something goes wrong, or someone stands you up for an interview, or like your leads go nowhere and you get a little desperate. And when that happened, I go and talk to other reporters who had gone through the same thing and who could tell me that I wasn't being crazy and that this is what happens. So it really, really helped to be surrounded by reporters who knew the conditions I was reporting in and knew the country and could tell me that I'd gotten far enough that it'd be a waste of time to stop. The rest of the time, I was just motivated by curiosity. It was such a strange place. I kept coming across really bizarre stories and really incredible people. And even if it was a rough day and I'd stepped in some cow dung and I was covered in dust and dirt and soot, I'd always have met one person who made me want to keep going, or who would ask me to go and ask the mayor why there was no water in the slum, or why suddenly everything was twice as expensive. And that kept me going. I sort of, towards the end, when I was tired and sick and bored with the whole thing, I just fed off the energy of the people around me. Sometimes I'd just go to the slum and sit on one end of the bridge, just watch and talk to people, just to feel good about the progress we'd made. So that was it. Oh, and lots of candy and lots of bitching to other journalists. And lots of reading as well. I read all these other stories that were similar, like The Corner by David Simon, where he spends a year in the middle of Baltimore during the drug wars. That was definitely way harder work than being in a slum in West Africa. He was around guns, he was getting shaken down by the police, he was around addicts who were spiraling out of control. And he made it work. And reading his postscripts and the way he wrote about the act of reporting and building compassion and working with your sources, that really, really helped. I read Maximum City, which was amazing. I was really, really struck by how much Mumbai was exactly like Accra. And it made the things that I was seeing seem so much less crazy and so much more like the way the world works when a country is developing. And of course, I also read Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo, which was comprehensive and showed me how all these little stories that people were telling me and all these little glimpses of life could be compiled into this great big compelling picture. Now, my work was nowhere near as good as any of those, but I got a sense that these reporters had been through the same difficulties and the same sense of boredom and the same panic about their work, and just driven through it, driven by the characters they met and the stories. Yeah.
You.
Okay, so Sneha, did that answer your question?
No.
She said, I asked, did that answer your question?
Oh, okay. All right. Yes, that did. Sorry.
Okay, so who wants to go next? Amitosh? Amitosh, do you have a question? Amitosh, do you have a question for Yepoka?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So, I'd like to know how do you decide what sort of audience to pitch your entire story to, and also go about writing it in a specific manner that it reaches the right crowd, the right sort of aiming to attract to read the story.
That's a great question, and I realized after the story was published that I kind of pitched it to one audience, and it ended up being popular with a completely different one. So when I was writing it, I was trying to explain not just Islam or the political conditions that led to its growth, but also the wider problems that Ghana was having as a growing economy that somehow had created no wealth for its poorest people. And I was kind of trying to explain this in layman's terms and make it compelling to sort of the friends and members of my family who never read this stuff. I wanted them to be interested in it because if I knew if I could pitch it at the simplest, most compelling level, then it would be easy to read for everyone. And so that was my initial idea, also because it was an exercise in developing my voice as a writer. And I found it easiest to talk to the people I regularly talk to when I go home and I talk to my friends who are teachers and lawyers and doctors, and I try to explain what it is that I do, and they think I do nothing. They think I go on holiday the whole time. So so that was the easiest way for me to do it, to pitch it as if I was talking to a friend or a family member who really had no interest in what I was doing, but was politely asking. It also meant that I made fewer assumptions about how much people would know about the subject, so I tried to be more careful when I was explaining the context or why there's raw sewage everywhere or how people end up living in a dump. And so that was my initial idea, and I think it ended up being a lazy one because I was doing what I was comfortable with. And then when I got feedback from people who had actually read the story, it was mostly people who already lived in countries with slums that were facing the same issues, or it was aid workers or development people or finance people. And I think maybe my cultural references and everything I put in there were too Western, and I didn't explain enough of this stuff in a universal way. So I think I made assumptions about how much people knew about British culture or American culture or what Sodom and Gomorrah is and all those details. So if I were doing it over, I'd be a lot more careful about that. And I think I'd think about a wider audience who knew a little more about the specifics and a little less about the generalities of life. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Awesome.
Shania, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Yes, I do.
Okay.
Hello?
Go. Yeah, we can hear. We can hear.
Hey,
Yeah, you can ask the question.
okay, Yepoka, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so I had two questions, one of which you pretty much answered. Okay, I can hear my own voice for a while. Sound okay? Yeah, you can hear me,
that sounds
right?
better. Yes, yeah, that's
Okay,
clean and
cool.
clear.
The first thing is there are a lot of things, right, which keep on troubling you when you want to inquire more about them. You want to work on them. So the first thing when you start working on something is what you want to work on, right? Choosing your
Yes,
battles is the toughest. Like you said, right? That you thought that you were comfortable in this certain sphere, and then you picked it up, and then you call yourself lazy, but I don't think so that you were. And I mean, yeah. So one that it's always better to work on something you're comfortable. But then, how do we push ourselves as writers?
yeah, yeah.
Second, when we're fine, we picked the story, everything is good, we're starting working on it. But then there's so much information to take, right? There's so much
Yes, yeah.
information to. It's always bombarding you, and there are a lot of narratives going on. So it's very
Yes.
difficult to choose which narrative to pick. So I want you to please elaborate on that, how to focus on what narrative you want to put through, what narrative you want to choose, and of course how you want to which battle do you pick? Yeah.
Yeah. Those are all such good questions, and those are the things I had the most trouble with. I explained how I reported using the memos and how I sent those to my editors. I mean, they were anything from 10,000 to 50,000 words. So I amassed a ridiculous amount of information, and I spent a month just absolutely lost in it. It was absolutely miserable. I was sort of reading through everything over and over again, trying to figure out where the structure was. And the most absurd thing there was that the structure was already there. I'd already written through it. And if I had paid more attention to the directions my reporting was leading me into, I would have seen that like a month earlier. But to the beginning, what do you decide to work on? I think, in as much as we can choose what we write about, something you're genuinely passionate and interested in beyond the surface is probably the best bet. Well, that or something you're about to get paid for. That's a lot of motivation on its own. But something you're genuinely interested in and will keep following when it gets hard and whether it gets uncomfortable to report. And something that will keep you sort
motivated.
Yeah, and keep driving you. And it's also really important to sort of early in your reporting get a sense of what the issues are, and there'll be dozens and dozens and dozens. But sort of focus on getting a sense of where the story is in the issue. So my initial problem was I was reporting on this big general issue with no story. I was just talking about a slum. And I spent a month doing this before I realized that without a story, the piece would be kind of pointless. And so instead of looking at the issue, I went about looking for stories. I went about talking to people who could give me a sense of their lives. So that's how I found the man who built the bridge. And I found out about his life story and how he came to that. That's how I found the slumlord who owned all the land around the bridge. Well, technically owned all the land around the bridge. And that's how I found the street girls who made up most of his clientele. And that's how I found out about how they came to the work they did. So I stopped looking at the issue of slums and started looking at the stories of the people living in them. And that helped a lot because stories had a beginning and a middle and an end and a clean narrative and issues you could follow up on. Sort of it started to organize my reporting along those lines. So God, I don't even know where to begin with all the collating information. It ended up helping that I'd sort of read everything. Like I'd pull clips from newspaper archives, I'd pull clips from magazines, I'd find everything there was to find on Google, I'd read every book on slum development, and then I'd just end up with this massive information in my head. And what ended up happening is that I just sort of make copious notes and then abandon them. And the stuff that was important would stick in my head, and the stuff that I needed to check, I had the notes to refer to. And that really helped as well when it came to the fact-checking right at the end, because I knew where all the information was, and I could just go back to it and check it out. Sorry, I've completely lost my thread here. I'm just babbling on.
It's okay. It's completely all right. I get it.
But what ended up happening was once I had my story, I had my narratives, and I had the larger issues I was looking at. So once I had the story of the lagoon and the fact that it was poisoning the city around it, I knew I had to look into all the attempts to clean it up, which led me to all these aid projects, and which led me to finding out what had happened to the $600 million and sort of making dozens and dozens of calls to people that eventually revealed that the money didn't actually exist. So everything sort of, if you follow a clean thread through your reporting and through your stories, it ends up cleaning up what you look at. And you just have to be really, really ruthless about, once you're done with your initial like big wave of reading, ignoring everything else that comes across.
Yeah.
Sure, please.
That reminds me of this small phrase I read somewhere that you have to write drunk and edit sober.
Yes, completely. Like, my first drafts were messy and sprawling and barely in English. It started to get really, really satisfying to go back into them and sort of chip away at details, get a good sense of what was important and what wasn't. And that's probably the drafts, like draft 12 or 14 or 18, that I started to go back and read through all the material I had gathered and like establish which facts were solid. And you finally get there. You find your way through if you just follow your stories and the leads they bring up.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Amika, do you have a question?
Yeah, okay. Hello.
Hi there.
When you were communicating to the locals there, did you have a language problem? Like, they'd be speaking
Yes.
something else?
Totally. So Ghana has
Did
about
you have a
100.
translator like with you?
I did. I had an amazing fixer, and so Ghana has like 100 ethnic groups, and each ethnic group has like a distinct language. And while everybody may speak like a bit of English or a bit of Pidgin, and everybody will speak Tree, which I can't, so that was
Mama?
useless. Um, what ended up happening was most people in the slum, because they're mostly migrants, can speak one of maybe 8 or 9 different languages. So it really helped that I had a fixer who spoke dozens of those languages and could translate for me. And then, because translations are choppy and messy, I'd go back to the same sources dozens of times and ask pretty much the same questions in different ways to sort of clear up the information and double check it. So the guy who owns the bridge, he could barely speak Pidgin, he could barely speak Tree, and my translator couldn't quite speak his language. So we'd end up sort of going through this patchwork of languages to establish the information. Then I'd go back and ask him the same question over and over again. Once I started getting the same answer, I knew I had that down. And it also helped just to sort of hang out in the slum and get a sense of what the place was like and what people's concerns were and how people talk to each other. And so what on my first journey was just a babble of stuff I could not understand at all slowly became sort of intelligible. And a lot of snatches of dialogue and information about what was going on in the slum came from just like sitting in the background and watching people go about their lives. I found that helped as much as having a translator and a fixer.
Okay. Thanks. That means you put a lot of time.
Yeah, the
The
most
more
difficult
time you
part.
put, the more you understand.
Completely, yeah. And the more time you spend there and you spend with sort of different sorts of people, the more you understand. Yeah, absolutely. I hope that answered your question.
Aditya?
Yeah, I have a question. Hi.
Hi.
When we have decided the issue we are going to write about, and we have lots of ideas, and when it is non-fiction, there's a lot of research involved. We have to work hard on the research part of the writing, and there is a lot of material after the research part is over. And
Yeah.
how do we make sure that the ending of the writing, the ending of the piece is not abrupt or sudden? And because it happens a lot with me that my articles end suddenly, abruptly. Help me with
Yeah.
that.
I had that trouble as well. Especially because we're writing non-fiction and you're sort of following people's lives or following issues that don't really have a conclusive end. So what ended up happening is that I binge watched like really, really good movies and TV shows to get a sense of how they built a story out of nothing. And it sounds absolutely absurd, but it really helped, like binge watching The Wire and Boardwalk Empire and things that had like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I ended up trying to emulate the 3-act structure of a play, where there's like you meet the character has this they want to get, and then there's this big complication, and then they find a way to resolve it at the end. And I tried to marry that with what I found in my reporting and get a sense of how people's lives had progressed, how they ended up in the slum, how they ended up doing the work they were doing, how they ended up either failing or succeeding at it, and where the point that brought them to, which for some people was the highest point of their career and for some people was the lowest point of their career. And so the logic of the story came through the reporting, and I just sort of followed that through. Sometimes you also have to be a bit ruthless and find your ending. So if you have a sense of the wider issues of your story, sort of use that to define the ending. So my story was largely about migrants, so I begin and end with a migrant who had found a moderate amount of success. Could you
Okay,
give me
so
a story?
in your case, focusing on the human part of the story helped in the concluding the piece.
Yeah. So could you give me an example of a story you've had trouble ending? I'm curious about this.
I was writing about a cycle repairman. who would who would repair cycles on a daily basis, and I didn't know how to go about ending, how to give a suitable ending to his problems that I've written about.
Ah, and so what was the story about beyond the actual story of the cycle repairman? Like, what was the larger theme?
I was writing about his aspirations to build a better future for for his children.
And had he managed to, or was he in the middle of it?
No, I somehow managed to write about how he's going to work on it, and how some people are ready to help him to make his dream real. So that's how I did it.
And did he, I mean, from what you saw, had he achieved his dream?
Hmm?
From what you saw, had he achieved his dream?
Cannot hear you.
Hi, is that a bit better? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
And from what you saw, had he achieved his dream?
He could not achieve his dream, but people started helping him financially, and they started aiding him in the process of sending his children to better schools, and he got a lot of financial help from the adjacent societies and etc. And
Okay.
I reported on that.
And how did you end up ending it?
I ended up on the hope part. I ended up with the hope that his children will have a better future than him.
That's a lovely comprehensive ending. If it's about finding this better future, ending on him almost
Yeah,
achieving that is pretty solid. Yeah.
I think that article ended pretty well, but I had a lot of struggle doing finding a suitable ending.
I always find that following the wider themes and following the way the reporting takes you really helps. And also it sometimes helps to
Yeah, so she's having certain connection problems. I'm hoping she'll be back soon. So until then, we can just decide who wants to go next after that. Oh yeah, wait. Yeah, can everyone hear us?
Yes. That question is you.
Okay, I have a question.
Uh,
If
uh,
she,
yeah, so we can ask the question. Yeah, she's back now.
okay.
hello.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, we can hear
Hi,
you.
Hi, sorry about that.
am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I am audible, right?
Yeah, Yepoka, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Okay. The last thing I was going to say, it also sometimes helps to go through your reporting and pick the super striking scene that you're going to start your piece with, and also just pick an end that has as much of the resolution that your character is looking for in it. So just going through all your reporting and all your scenes and all your interactions.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, one second. Azia, did that answer your question?
Hello?
Yeah. Yepoka, we can hear you. I'm just checking with
Yes,
Aditya.
yeah, it's a shaky line, but I can hear it.
Yeah. Aditya?
Yeah,
Yeah, did that answer your question?
yes, that certainly answered my questions. Thank you, Yepoka.
Okay, next we have yeah, you can go ahead. You can ask a question.
Okay. Sanjana, so
Hello?
it's about if you had to fake while talking to those people, like if you had a hard time getting to know them, like getting to know
Uh,
their stories.
One second, yeah, one second. Yepoka, can you hear us?
Yeah, it's a bit echoey, but I can hear you.
Yeah. You'll have to just be closer to the mic. Then Yepoka can hear you clear.
Can you hear me now? Okay, she's
Okay.
I can see she's
Okay, she's
Oh, yeah. Yepoka, I think you've muted your mic. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can ask
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay.
Fantastic.
I'll repeat my question.
Yeah, yeah. You can repeat your question.
Okay. So I was a tiny bit curious about, do you have to face any criticism while getting to know them as people? Like, did you have a hard time for them to open up?
Your voice is breaking.
My voice. Am I audible now?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay.
So,
Yeah,
okay, she's not there anymore.
connection's a little bad. I'm hoping she'll be back soon.
Krishna, what have you done? Terrible mental.
Yeah, so you can just speak closer to the mic so she can hear you better.
Where's the mic?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
am I audible right?
Uh, Yepoka, can you hear us?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. Can
Okay,
you hear
yeah.
me okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can hear you.
I'll say it again.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I want. Okay. So I wanted to know if you had a hard time getting to know those people. Like, did you face a lot of criticism? Did they hate you at first? And like, yeah, that's my question.
Hi, sorry, the line is just breaking into noise.
I think she was asking if she had a hard time. Yeah, so,
Chat.
Yepoka, I'll read the question.
I think there's an option, right?
Yeah, I'll repeat your question. It's okay. So Yepoka, her question was, when it came to a point that did you face any particular criticism while talking and interviewing different people while you were there, and what did you do to get them to open up and talk to you? Did you have
And
any?
when they opened up, you have to set
Oh,
up
okay.
then to flow.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can answer the question, Yepoka. We can hear you.
Hello, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. A lot of the time what ended up happening is if someone was not at all interested, actually, yes, that might be useful. But I'll start answering anyway. So what happened is that you get a sense of who was interested in talking to you and who wasn't by sort of their body language and their responses. And so if someone was absolutely completely uninterested in you, there's no point in pushing that unless you absolutely need the source. And I'll come back to that later. The rest of the time, if someone was vaguely resistant, it was usually because they had other stuff to do. These were all working people. And so I'd try to be respectful of that, and I'd offer to come back on a Sunday when nobody was working or come back in the evening when they had some time for me, which helped a lot of the time because then I get them relaxed and I get them at home and it was easier to talk. Other times it was just a matter of sort of like talking to them a little and then asking if you could just fade into the background and watch their day unfold. And with a lot of the people, especially the people where there was sort of a great big language barrier, that helped a lot more. It helped to see how they interacted with people, and you got a better sense of their personalities from just watching them work or watching them go about their day. So I'd fade into the background until they were comfortable with me just hanging out there while other stuff happened. And then whenever there was a quiet moment or something I wanted to ask about, I'd ask my questions there. That was another really, really time-consuming thing. When it was a reluctant source, and these were usually the officials that I absolutely had to speak to, I'd sort of just try to strike a balance between harassing them so they knew I wasn't going away and they'd have to talk to me anyway, and sort of being respectful of their point of view. So I didn't go to the council and say, you are failing 80,000 people and people are dying because of you. I asked more about sort of what are the challenges in making this work, and what are the challenges posed by the community, and how do you respond to criticism that you are neglecting these people because they're not important enough for a tax block or something like that. For the officials, I did go in with a specific set of questions because there were facts I needed to establish. With everybody else, I just got a sense of what it is I wanted to know about their lives, and then I just went with the flow. And because I was spending so much time there, if anything else came up, I could always go back and ask them again. I found it more useful to go with the flow because it felt less like I was interrogating them on their lives, and more that I was just sort of genuinely interested in what happened to them. Because I used to go in with like a set of rigid questions, and I'd end up getting rote and not particularly revealing answers. But when it felt more like a conversation and it felt more like a back and forth, the answers were better, the interactions were better, and I got sort of more intimate and interesting scenes. And people felt a bit more themselves around me, which was really, really useful. Because generally, people are sort of awkward about being watched and questioned and interrogated, especially when they know they live in this place that's controversial and looked down upon. Did that help?
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, Yepoka, we have time only for one more question. Okay, so who wants to go? Anyone from here? Yeah, sure. So, Yepoka, we have one last question, okay?
Hi.
Hi.
So, I think the major part that worked in your case was that we were able to picturize what exactly happened there. Right. So, can you hear me?
I can, but it's would you mind typing the question as well, just so I can get the details?
Yeah.
Am I
audible? Amitosh, can you mute your mic, please?
Hello?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me now?
Great. It's still a bit shaky, so I'm going to log out and log in again to see if I can get a better line. I'll be about 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Control that video.
What's up, Krishna?
Wait, where did that come from?
Yes, I want to play with you.
Amitosh? Probably Amitosh.
Yeah, it's obviously you.
Oh, Amitosh. I don't see you.
Exactly.
You can't copy my lights, you know. Yeah, so Yepoka is going to log off and log in.
Krishna, show us. I can't see you.
I will not show myself.
She's trying to show you the screen and you obviously.
Wait, I'll show you my face in a bit.
No, this is that. What is Krishna doing? Okay, she's back.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Everybody sounds much better. Thank you for bearing with me. I apologize for the pathetic internet speed I'm working with.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes, so my question was, in any story, the main part would be to make sure that your audience can picturize what exactly you experience, right? That
Yeah.
works really well with your story, which is the best part. So for us as amateur writers, what do you suggest we should do to ensure that our audience can picturize what we see?
That's a really great question. That took me the longest time. Um, when I was making my notes and when I was reporting on it, I took sort of pornographically detailed notes about everything I was seeing and smelling and feeling, because that's the thing that struck me most about the slum. I've never been anywhere so intense. But then I just ended up with like paragraphs and paragraphs of like clouds of flies and sewage smells and the smell of cooking and like the sound of music, and it all made absolutely no sense because there was just too much of it. So in editing, we ended up focusing on the details that said something salient about the scene. So when I'm in someone's home and we're talking about their career, it's not necessarily relevant to talk about the fact that somebody's cooking soup so the entire smells, the entire room smells. But it is kind of relevant to say that it's a modest house because they're saving all their money because they have to send it all of it home. So I tried to focus on the details that told you something about the exact scene. And that was only possible because I had such like detailed, bizarrely exhaustive notes. And all of this was back in editing the initial versions. I had absolutely every detail in the scene, and it ended up being overwhelming and also a little dull. And some of my details started to come off as offensive. If I described someone's home as smelling funny or being absolutely covered in flies, it started to seem like a moral judgment on the person, and I was trying to avoid that. So I put all those details in the big, like, overall paragraphs where I'm trying to describe the overall scene before I zoom down on that. And the other thing that was to try and keep the detail at the level I was writing at. So if it was like I was giving you a great big overall sense of what everything in this area looked like, I could talk about like the smells wafting through the smoke everywhere. But if I was telling about what the person was doing, all the details would focus on that person specifically. If that makes any sense?
Yes, yes, that does. That answers my question. Thank you so much.
Super, thank you.
Yepoka?
Hi.
Hi. So I have one last question. Actually, I have Sumit here with me. You remember Sumit? He's the one who connected us.
Yes.
Hi. Sounds like the question.
Good to see you.
You have a question? I get to ask a question?
Yeah. Sumit has a question.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure my question is not coming at the cost of anybody asking one. So, okay, so I'll probably start, before the question I'll set a rather more poetic premise. So the creative process, the intent of doing this was to possibly help the creative process that a writer or a storyteller goes through. And the creative process is a little like a girl that you're trying to get. And she's not saying no and she's not saying yes. So it's a beautiful thing and it's also a painful thing.
Indeed.
So the reason I'm saying this is that although my core area of expertise is not the writing bit, but I constantly am trying to find out what makes people tell stories or how can you improve the entire process. So a lot of the times I have come across conflicts myself and among other people that we work with. Is there are two aspects of this. One is the art bit of it. So when you're writing a story, there's the art and skill of writing it. And when you're talking about especially narrative non-fiction, there's the subject and there is the exact idea itself. And sometimes those two things collide. And the art and the skill collide with the idea or being true to the subject. What does one do? And I've seen a lot of people around us, they place more emphasis on the art and skill and they lose out on the story. So how do you tackle it?
I sort of had an approach to this before I started the story, because before I went to Columbia Journalism School, I was a sort of straight print reporter. And so everything I was taught was about sort of the fidelity to the subject and making everything as clean and as straightforward as possible. And we also kind of had the art beaten out of us.
Okay.
And this project was more about sort of finding a way to put the art back into my writing
Okay.
and develop my voice while still being really, really serious about the subject. Sorry, can you all hear me?
Yeah. Please go.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
I feel like I have a massive echo. So what ended up happening is that I tried to stay as true to the subject as possible in my earliest drafts.
Okay.
So I'd check all the facts, I'd make sure the core of the story was there, and I'd make sure that if it was just a 500-word newspaper story about a thing that happened, everything that would be in the story was there. But of course, these drafts were really dry and not particularly interesting to read.
Okay.
So my redrafting involves going through it like line by line by line and putting it in my voice and injecting as many flourishes as I could without distracting from the subject. Because I already had like the basic form of everything down, it was easier to go in and redraw it. So all of that for me happened in the redrafting and in the considering and reconsidering everything I was doing. And it didn't really feel like a big debate for me, because even though the story was about making the subject come alive, nobody was really going to read it if it was dry and boring, and it needed a soul, it needed that art.
Yeah.
So they weren't necessarily mutually exclusive for me, but the greatest battle for me was making it less a piece of straight writing and making it narrative nonfiction with a distinct voice, and injecting things like humor and color and detail, the things that sort of pull people through a story and stop them reading. Now, this wasn't necessarily successful. I know plenty of people who got through about like 1,000 words before giving up. But that's part of the process for me as well. I know that the next giant thing I work on, the art will probably end up being paramount, because that seemed to be what kept people going through what was otherwise a really, really tough subject to read through.
Right. So, like, it's a draft thing, right? So, would you suggest, like, when writers approach like a complex non-fiction narrative when that they want to write, so should people like completely keep editing out when they like write their first draft?
No, I mean, everybody works completely differently. This is what just ended up working for me. I wanted to make sure that the story was clean and clear.
Okay.
And that I had all, like, there were a million different facts in that, and I wanted to make sure I had all of those down before I injected anything else. And this was just the easiest way for me to write, because I was so used to it and I was so accustomed to it. Other people may find that a completely lyrical or poetic or literary draft works better, and then you can sort of whittle it down and clean out all the like chaff.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But you will need to rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and look at every draft critically with as much time as possible, or as you can get.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Yay. Yepoka, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, you can answer. Yeah.
Yeah, can
I think it would be best if you could type out the question, because
She's already.
That's yeah.
I typed my question.
yeah, you type the question.
I see it. That is a great question. Because, sorry, can you still hear me? Is everything okay if I do this?
Yepoka, we didn't read the question, so if you could tell us the question and then the answer, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Her question is, how do you keep the content interesting?
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So this ended up being another thing that happened in my draft, where I sort of write this great big 20,000 word thing, and there'd be whole stretches that even I couldn't read through again and again. Like they drag really slowly, or it would just be like a line of disjointed facts with no particular fidelity to the stuff around it. So I ended up cutting the piece into sections and then trying to make sure every section had an interesting scene in it, a character that would keep you going in it, and then that all the facts were sort of integrated in that. So it's like that thing where, you know, when they're first teaching you to write essays in school, it'd be like a fact and an interpretation of the fact and an analysis of the thing. I ended up cutting all my sections into themes, and then having these themes tied to the scene and to the character and to the facts that were woven into it. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it was just a matter of like going through it paragraph by paragraph, scene by scene, and spotting the places where I got bored with reading my own work. And then trying to figure out what that was, whether I was going on too long with the statistics and whether I could cut something out, whether the scene dragged but didn't say anything in the middle and could be trimmed. And
Please just know my Yepoka, it's okay.
Yeah,
right,
that
okay.
answers.
Okay.
Hello?
Does that help?
Am I?
Yeah.
Okay, like. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, it answers my question. And can I ask if possible?
I'm sorry?
Is it possible if I ask another question?
It's up to Yepoka.
I'm up to, yes, that's absolutely fine. I'd love to.
Sometimes you tend to get diverted.
I think it's better you type the question again.
Yeah, that's probably the safest thing. Oh, I forgot to add one more detail,
Yeah.
which is like bribe or beg or harass as many people as you can into reading your drafts, and people who can be brutally honest with you, and they will happily tell you where they get bored, and they will happily tell you where they've lost interest. How do I prevent myself from diverting from the main subject? That ended up happening in the redrafting as well. You sort of, you have a better sense of what it is that's irrelevant to your draft once you have the draft down. And so my reporting was actually a lot more sprawling and useless than it need be, because I followed absolutely every lead that I found at the bridge. But I didn't need to. I think if I had known that my focus would have been the infrastructure project and the bridge and how this migrant sort of made a life for himself, I probably wouldn't have followed absolutely everybody I'd come across. But because I did, what ended up happening was when I was going through my notes, I'd sort of throw out some of the people because either they weren't particularly interesting or they said the same thing as four other sources and not in as interesting a way. And then when I drafted, I had like dozens and dozens and dozens of characters in, and I just have to remove their scenes because they repeated the same themes or talked about the same subjects, or they just weren't as gripping as the ones I kept in. And we went back and forth with my editors about sort of adding and subtracting characters until there was a balance between sort of interesting things happening and people saying different things. And then through that process, you sort of like strip out everything that's irrelevant. And it takes some time to realize where you've doubled up or where you have pointless information. And I think part of the reporting process and part of getting this like big overview of your subject is letting yourself digress and letting yourself go into these sort of down these completely pointless paths, because it's only then you know what the key and the core of the issue is. And by the time you're done with your reporting and you're done with a couple of drafts, you know your subject back to front, so you know what is and isn't relevant. So it comes to you. Did that help? Did that answer your question?
Was I audible? Yeah, it does answer my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Yepoka, it's been really nice talking to you. I'm sure these guys learned loads from you.
Thank you so much for having me, and apologies again for the horrible internet connection.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, we didn't have any issues. Is there anything that you would like to tell them before we close the conversation?
There's just one last question from Snell, which is what the next project I'm working on. So the last big thing I wrote, which fingers crossed gets published on Monday or Tuesday, is about two teenage boys who work on this horrible electronic waste dump after school and on weekends to be able to pay their own school fees. So I followed around them for a day while they like burnt old copper wire and went scavenging for scraps and stuff like that. So that's the last giant thing I was working on. And like throughout, I've been working on tiny analysis stories about Ghanaian economics and politics. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Also, Yepoka, we don't really know about the big round table that much, so you mind giving us like a quick brief about the big round table?
Yeah, the Big Round Table was started at Columbia University by one of our professors, Michael Shapiro, and the idea was to sort of find a space for stories that usually don't get told because they're either not particularly profitable or they don't really fit the news agenda. So they've had weirdest things. The renaissance of disco, American neo-Nazis, ancient massacres that got no attention at the time, like some spectacular, like Click Around. They've got some incredible stories already and some incredible stories coming as well. I know another friend who's working on a big roundtable story about a serial killer in Botswana, like stuff you never hear about anything else. And it's a group of editors, like world editors who will be like sprawling, ignored stories along the narratives. And it's a donation method, so members of the audience donate to the writers, and that's how the story works out, although they're currently working on changing that now. Yeah, and they are open to stories wherever they're from. So they've had like current students at Columbia University, current students at universities elsewhere, done them with freelance writers. So if you've got like a story you're really, really itching to tell, it's worth submitting it to the big round table.
Thank you so much, Yepoka. It's been really nice talking to you. I mean, it's been wonderful that I know it's a little early for you there back in New York, so I really appreciate you coming online.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah.
Just wanted to thank you too. Thanks for coming on, and also relay our thanks to Michael. I'll personally write to him and thank him. It's been a really good start. And the idea was to kind of treat this as a series of collaborations, and we love the work that you guys are doing at the Big Round Table. I had one of the most amazing conversations with Michael when I did it. We discussed a lot of ideas, and so the idea is to involve people like you who've written complex stories, who've gone through the creative process, to kind of share your experience with people who want to do it, and in the process, obviously the stories get discovered, and that's a good thing that happens. So would you what do you think about the event and how can we make it better? What is your feedback on something like this?
I love the idea. I love hearing from what other writers are going through and how they deal with those standard issues that all of us come across. Like these aren't UK things, these aren't unique things. So it really helps to hear from other writers. And I love the format. Really, the only problem was my horrible internet connection. And I know dozens and dozens of writers who'd be happy to talk about their work and to find out what other people are working on as well. Like really, there were times during the story where the only thing that kept me sane was talking to another journalist or another writer or another photographer who could tell me that what I was going through wasn't new and it wasn't unique and there were ways around it. Yeah, that's what all my advice.
I think the next one is going to be with I think somebody who's like I was a New York-based writer. He's 23. He's I think written a piece where you've done a Medium project together. I don't know. I forgot the name, but yeah, we're doing a next one very soon. Michael introduced me to him. So yeah, it's definitely something that we want to keep on doing. So yeah, thanks a lot again. I love what you guys are doing at the Big Round Table, and all the best to you.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Yepoka. So wait, I just unmute their mic, so I'm sure they all want to say bye.
Sorry?
Yeah, so there, yeah, it's just thank you for coming on. I'm just letting them all say bye to you because I'm sure they want to.
Absolutely.
So yeah, guys, everyone, let's say three cheers for Yepoka. Hip hip. So I actually need to take a picture, so people come around. I want to take a picture. Yes. They're all just standing around. So anyone is smiling at me? Thank you so much, Yepoka. I hope you have a really nice day. Bye. Bye.
Bye bye, bye bye, bye bye.
Bye. We can't.